Father Boyle is the subject of Academy Award winner Frida Lee Mock's 2012 documentary called G-Dog. He has received the California Peace Prize and inducted into the California Hall of Fame. In 2014, the White House named Father Boyle a Champion of Change. He received the 2016 Humanitarian of the Year Award from the James Beard Foundation, the National Culinary Arts Organization. Father Boyle is one of the most inspirational voices and speakers of our time, and we are really privileged to have him here with us as our inaugural disruptor for change for good. He is Father Greg Boyle.
Thank you, Giselle. I think it's important to talk about what are we disrupting. I turned on CNN and the big banner was attack on Republicans. And I remember thinking, wow, really? You know, we couldn't be that so unsophisticated, you know. But I thought it was an interesting thing. You know, this wasn't the story of a guy with opinions. It was a mentally ill man with an assault weapon. What are we disrupting? We're disrupting this notion that it's possible that there are some folks who aren't our own, who don't belong to us. Mother Teresa diagnosed the world's ills correctly, I think, when she said that the problem is that we've forgotten that we belong to each other. And these are kind of untenable situations for ourselves as people. The guy who opened up fire because he had to carry clearly mental illness, he belongs to us. And so does Dylan Roof, who killed 8 people at Mother Emanuel Church. He belongs to us. Find me somebody who doesn't belong to us, who isn't our own. I don't think you'll be able to find anybody. And I think that's key. Until we know that there are no such thing as bad guys, and much less bad hombres. For 30 years I've worked with gang members. I've never met one. I've never met an evil person. Never. Because the minute you start to know what people carry, it breaks through. And you stand in awe at what folks have to carry rather than in judgment at how they carry it. Everybody belongs. It's where you begin. And so you imagine a circle of compassion, then you imagine nobody standing outside that circle. That's what we try to disrupt, is the notion that there just might be lives out there that matter less than other lives. We stand against it. And you stand at the margins with the poor and the powerless and the voiceless and those whose dignity has been denied and those whose burdens, including mental illness, are more than they can bear, for which you can only have one response: compassion. And that's why it's untenable in our country, because we have to hate them. And then you stand against demonizing so that the demonizing will stop. And you stand with the disposable so that the day will come when we stop throwing people away. And then Homeboy becomes a sanctuary for folks who feel less than. And then they become the sanctuary that they sought there. And then they go home and provide and present sanctuary for their kids, and cycles get broken. We belong to each other. And so we try to create a community of kinship such that God, in fact, might recognize it. And Homeboy really is about healing. In our early days, you know, we were about nothing stops a bullet like a job. An educated inmate may or may not return to prison, or an employed one may or may not return to prison, but a healed gang member won't ever go back to prison, period. I would bet my whole life on that. And we have people like Miguel and Jose who are here, who are not just homeboys and been in prison a long time, but are leaders. But in the end, the invitation is to somehow acknowledge that we belong to each other. And so that we can say everybody is our own. And And mass incarceration just won't matter to people unless folks know that we all belong, that there is no us and them, there's just us. And Homeboy wants to be what the world is ultimately invited to become, which is this place of kinship and connection. There's a homie named Danny who I knew as a little kid, 13 years old, and he was a knucklehead. He was so into his gang and so into his vadio, and he was always putting in work for his neighborhood. And he once vowed to me, as I saw him where his homies kicked it in this alley, he said, I won't ever step foot in Homeboy Industries. But I got to know him, and saw him when he was in juvenile hall and in probation camp and youth authority. Finally, he went to prison at 18, but only did 2 years. And we always say at Homeboy, because it's recovery essentially, it takes what it takes in recovery. The birth of a son, the death of a friend, a long stretch in prison. It takes what it takes for people to kind of redirect their lives. And so Danny gets out after 2 years in prison, and his mother was dying of pancreatic cancer. And a large family, but he was the designated hospice caregiver. It was so tender and gentle to watch this kid by her bedside, especially knowing that this woman actually tortured this kid when he was a child. And so he was there every day taking care of her, and then she died. And a week later, I buried her. And a week after that, he walked into Homeboy Industries. And so he worked there, and I could watch him from my little perch in my glass enclosed office, as you saw there. And wow, there he is, and he's got his arm around enemies, rivals, guys I know he used to shoot at. I know he did. Because I was there, and he was back in school, and he got his GED, and then he went to ELAC, and he kind of inhabited the truth of who he was, that he was exactly what God had in mind when God made him, and he was becoming that truth. And so he comes into my office one day, and his big dramatic kind of introduction to what he was going to tell me was, what happened to me yesterday, he says, has never happened to me in my life. And so he tells me that he was on the Gold Line after the office had closed, and he was taking the train east to go home. And it was a packed train, but he was able to get a seat. And he said, standing right in front of him, hanging onto this kind of pole, he said, was a medio pedo guy, a guy who was a little bit drunk. He said, I know he's a homie because I can see tattoos on his hand, but he's an older guy. I don't really know who he is. And Danny was wearing a Homeboy sweatshirt that said, jobs, not jails, big thing that said Homeboy Industries. And the little bit drunk guy says, hey, you work there? And Danny doesn't think he ought to really engage this guy, and so he kind of nods. Is it any good? And Danny says, well, it's helped me. In fact, I don't think I'm going to go back to prison because of this place. And then he stands up, and he fishes into his pocket, and he finds a piece of paper and a pen. And he starts to write on this piece of paper the address at Homeboy Industries. And as he's telling me the story, he says, I couldn't believe I knew the address by heart, And so he writes it out, and he hands it to the guy. And he says, come see us. We'll help you. And the guy studies the piece of paper, and he says, thank you. And the train stops, and the guy gets off, and Danny takes his seat again. And then you can tell he's starting to feel the emotion, and he says, what happened to me next has never happened to me in my life. Everyone on the train was looking at me. Everyone on the train was nodding at me. Everyone on the train was smiling at me. And for the first time in my life, I felt admired. Absolutely nothing can change until we stand against forgetting that we belong to each other. It's how it works. And so we kind of dedicate ourselves, I think, to the slow work of God, which is to be in kinship with each other and to insist on it. And even times like these in which we live remind us of the things we care about. It occurs to people, universities mainly, to force their students sometimes to read my book against their will, and I'm not complaining. But Gonzaga University, my alma mater, forced the freshman class to read my book for the summer before they started, and so they called me and said, would you come and speak? And it'll be a huge kind of venue with 1,000 people, including all these freshmen. And I said, sure. And they said, can you bring 2 homies with you? And I said, sure. So I invited 2 homies, Bobby, African-American gang member who worked in our bakery at the time, and Mario, who at the time worked in our merchandise store. Mario is probably the most tattooed individual who has ever worked there. He's all sleeved out, and his neck is blackened with the name of his gang, and head shaved and covered in tattoos, and forehead, cheeks, chin, eyelids. And I'd never actually been in public with him, you know, so we were walking through Burbank and people are like this, you know, and mothers are clutching their kids a little more closely. And I'm thinking, wow, isn't that interesting? Because if you were to go to Homeboy Industries tomorrow and asked anyone who is the kindest, most gentle soul who works there, no one will say me. They'll say Mario. He sells baked goods behind the counter at the bakery. Kind, gentle. He's proof that only the soul that ventilates the world with tenderness has any chance of changing the world. So we get to Gonzaga. And so I tell Mario and Bobby, I said, I'm not going to speak in any of these classroom ones. You will. And they're nervous, especially Mario. But they get up and they do a good job. And there's stories of terror and torture and violence and abuse of every imaginable kind. And honest to God, if their stories had been flames, you'd have to keep your distance. Otherwise, you'd get scorched. Very moving. So then I did my 45 minutes or whatever, and then I invited them to come on up and yeah, yes ma'am. And a woman stands and she says, yeah, I got a question, it's for Mario. First question out the gates for Mario. So Mario, he comes and he clutches the microphone and yes, and he's just terrified, and he's this tall drink of water, little skinny guy. And the woman says, well, you say you're a father and you have a son and a daughter and they're about to enter their teenage years. What wisdom do you impart to them? You know, what advice do you give them? And Mario just clutches the microphone and he closes his eyes and I can feel the emotion starting to rise, and he's getting a damn hernia trying to come up with some answer, you know, and when suddenly he blurts out, and as soon as he says those 2 words, he retreats back to his closed-eyed, microphone-clutching retreat. And he's trembling now. But he wants to get this answer out. I just don't want my kids to turn out to be like me. And there's silence until the woman who asked the question stands, and now it's her turn to cry, and she says, why wouldn't you want your kids to turn out to be like you? You are loving, you are kind, you are gentle, you are wise. I hope your kids turn out to be like you. And 1,000 total perfect strangers stand. And they will not stop clapping. And all Mario can do is hold his face in his hand, so overwhelmed that this room full of strangers had returned him to himself. And they in turn returned to themselves, because it is exquisitely mutual.
Lovely son. You're great.
When we enter into kinship with each other. When we declare with our lives that there is no one who is not our own. No one. And so we stand against forgetting that we belong to each other. Amen.
I got a warm applause for Father. You're about to celebrate, or at least commemorate, 30 years, 3 decades with Homeboy. What's the biggest takeaway? If you had to summarize just the one thing you've learned from the capacity of the human being, what would it be?
Well, I've learned a lot. You know, Homeboy has evolved over the years. You know, I think if you, our treatment plans are only as good as our diagnosis. And so Homeboy has sort of helped the city of Los Angeles arrive at a diagnosis. And it did that, I think, by listening to people, by receiving people, by allowing yourselves to be reached by them. So I think if you listen, people will tell you. I think it's the difference between humility and hubris. You know, humility asks folks on the margins, what would help? And hubris says, here's what your problem is. And I think it's important at the get-go to kind of choose a stance that wants to receive who people are and delight in who they are. I mean, the day won't ever come when I have more courage, or I am more noble, or I'm closer to God. I mean, it just absolutely, they've taught me more than all the stuff that's valuable. And so, but we as an organization, you know, have really moved through all sorts of periods. You know, we worked with gangs in the early days, and now we say we don't work with gangs, we work with gang members, because we don't want to supply oxygen to gangs. And that was something we learned. And, you know, we were an employment dispatching industry where we were sending homies to employment, but there wasn't essential healing that happened. And so they had no resilience, and they hadn't re-identified who they are in the world. And so we learned that, you know, over 30 years. And so now we're in a different place, and I like where we are, because it's a community of tenderness. If love is the answer, community is the context, but tenderness is the methodology. Tenderness is the connective tissue. Otherwise, love stays in the air or in your head. But so we're not a transactional agency. Homeboy is relational, because that's the only thing that works. I think if you go through this country and find programs that not only work but help, it's because they're anchored in relationships. That's why folks show up every day, because it's unrelenting in its relational tenderness. And that's a foreign thing to the gang member.
There was a woman in the film that I think said so much. She said, Father G says hello to me by my name. So people feel seen, not just by their tattoos or their affiliation, but they feel seen. We live in a world today where so many are not seen. You say to be in service, to a real expression of compassion is not just to be in service, it is actually to see, as you said, kinship in one another. It's so very hard in the outside world, in politics, in corporate America, in Los Angeles, in both East-West, when such separatism, such shame of the poor and the disenfranchised is occurring more than ever. Can what you've done at Homeboy Industries translate into this infrastructure? Do you see it happening?
Well, you know, again, that's why it's important, I think, sometimes to underscore what needs to be disrupted, you know, because we get complacent, you know. I even think in terms of, if you'll permit me, you know, because I think we have two kinds of gods. You know, there's the God we actually have, and then there's the God we've settled for. So, because recently I'd visited Mother Emanuel Church, and I remember, you know, just days after this terrible tragedy had happened, and we all recall it, family members were standing in front of Dylan Roof and forgiving him. And everybody knew that you were in the presence of the God we actually have. But cut to, I don't know, 9 months later when they decide to execute him and call it God's justice. That's the God we've settled for. That's the God who's more realistic. That's the partial God. And so I think it's important to know what it is that we're being called to disrupt. At Homeboy, one of the homies said the other day, all of us homies are used to being watched, but we're not used to being seen. So you disrupt those little things that we settle for all along the way. And because the goal is to become and again, this is my perspective, but it's, you want to be in the world who God is, compassionate, loving, kindness. And frankly, you know, Jesus took only 4 things seriously: inclusion, nonviolence, unconditional, compassionate, loving kindness. That's one thing. And acceptance. And when we resist today and want to disrupt, what are we disrupting? We're disrupting this inclination, as Bob was saying, you know, to exclude, and the tolerance for violence, and conditions on our love, and wholesale rejection of people. So this isn't about, and I agree with Bob, this isn't about elections or who won. This isn't about Republican or Democrat. This is really huge, because when you stand against forgetting that we belong to each other, you embrace those things that you have to take seriously, that will show us how to resist in compelling ways. And so I think these are not just interesting times, but they're urgent in terms of what are we invited really to acknowledge what it is that we really care about. And I think it's going to, you know, the arc is going to move in such a way that we lead, you know, inextricably to kinship. 30 years ago, Homeboy Industries for the first 10 years was hated, despised, bomb threats, death threats, hate mail. Not from gang members, because we always represented hope for them, but folks who hated gang members, who demonized. And it's hard to retrieve that time because they really kind of don't exist. Not like in those days, Operation Hammer and Wipe 'em Out, and that's not around today like it was 20 years ago. And that's good. So for people who get discouraged about how long this is taking, well, you know, you just make progress in the good. And you believe in the things that are good and true and right and just. And you believe that only the soul that can ventilate the world with tenderness has any shot at this anyway.
You make me cry when I hear you in person and in all your speeches that I've seen on YouTube, because you are so just bloody humane and deeply see the grace in the broken and the not broken. But I wonder, as a human being, and when I've read Mother Teresa's work, she has said that she even doubted her faith and struggled in her service. And I wonder, you know, is it easy for you, in your capacity, in your tenure now, 3 decades, to always see the grace in the tattooed hardness that first arrives? Or is it something you had to work at? And I pray that it is, because it will give us all hope to be able to do the same.
No, I've really found it quite easy. No, I'm just kidding. No, I mean, but part of the thing is, you know, I did it wrong for a long time. You know, in my early years, I thought I was supposed to save people. And I think saving lives is for the Coast Guard. So I sort of stopped doing that. And then it's more accompaniment. And then it's, you're going to hold up the mirror and I'm going to, you know, remind you who you are. And then you want to see folks as God sees them. And that's really quite easy. But you know, Thich Nhat Hanh has a poem, it's more about anger, but in it he says, keep your loneliness warm. And part of what he means is, don't let your brokenness and your own wound be very far, because you're going to need it every day. Because if you don't welcome your own wound, you will be tempted to despise the wounded. And that is sort of a diagnosis of what's happening in our country at the moment, because you can't allow yourself to be strangers to your own brokenness, because you will be tempted to despise the broken. That's why you need to keep your loneliness warm. That's why you need to keep it right at hand, so you can get underneath behavior. What language is this behavior speaking? What kind of pain is this person in? Nobody doubts for a second that the God we actually have asks that question of the guy who opened fire on the baseball practice yesterday. I mean, nobody doubts that for even a second. Now, we don't operate out of that because we've settled for a more realistic God. But nobody doubts in their heart that God says, wow, what kind of pain is that guy in? Because he belongs to me. And so it forces you to ask that question. I think, you know, and the California Endowment and Bob has made so much progress in this, that the new frontier is really the mental health issue. That it's not just about stigmatizing. It's once we can stand in awe at what folks have to carry, then we're going to leave judgment behind. And then compassion is going to rush in. The largest mental institution in the world is LA County Jail. What does that tell us? We're in denial. We'd rather think that people are bad rather than unwell. And that will change someday, but that has to change. Because we love striking the high moral distance between us and them. We are not like that guy that opened up fire yesterday morning in Virginia. But he belongs to us. And that's a tough stance to take. But nobody doubts for a second that it's the only stance that God takes.
You have seen practically the transcendence of hate. Enemies come together and work together. How does that happen realistically, and why does it happen? When they see themselves in each other, and it's something that can be projected into the national narrative.
Well, gang violence is about something else. This is why, in my own history of doing this, I stopped doing shuttle diplomacy, peace treaties, ceasefires. I stopped doing it because I always believe that you need to be anchored in this work in the two refusals. You refuse to demonize a single gang member, and you refuse to romanticize a single gang. You have to romanticize a gang if you're bringing them together. You have to. There's no other way around it, because you have to see them as nation states or Northern Ireland or the Middle East, and they aren't. Gang violence is the language of the despondent and the traumatized. Infuse hope to folks for whom hope is foreign, or heal the damaged and the traumatized, or deliver mental health services in a timely and culturally appropriate way. Then you're really doing something. But we're all into kind of symptom relief. We all want to calm the cough of the lung cancer patient rather than deal with the lung cancer. And it's too bad, because it's short-sighted. And then we're scratching our heads why we don't make progress. I'm old-fashioned. I think peacemaking requires conflict. There is no conflict in gang violence. There's violence, but there's no conflict. It's not about anything. Those diagnoses, the key diagnostic moments, are always important. Because once you know that, okay, I'm not going to do that anymore, because that just serves the cohesion of gangs. That supplies oxygen, one gang member at a time. And Homeboy is historically in this county, it's the exit ramp. Even for gang members who have never walked through the door, in their imagination, it's important that it exists. It's a little bit like some essential piece of infrastructure in the LA County. I don't know what would happen. It's a little bit like what would happen if the Golden Gate Bridge just fell over. It would be more than inconvenient in San Francisco. It would be so disruptive. And that's tough, because I know if Homeboy was a shelter for abandoned puppies, we'd be endowed by now. But we're not, No place on the planet has more gang members who show up wanting to redirect their lives. We don't recruit, we don't coax, we don't force. They have to walk through the door. And there is no place anywhere in this country where more gang members walk through the door. And yet, we shouldn't struggle as much as we do. And that's too bad, because that's only because we haven't arrived at that moment of kinship where we can say, yeah, they belong to us too. And they are some mother's son, and they have kids. And we're all better off if we can say, yeah, we're going to help them too. It doesn't just have a singular impact on public safety in the county in which we all live, but it's also a step in the direction of God's dream come true. And I think the only thing that quenches God's thirst is our connection to each other, is our union, is our kinship.
You often quote Martin Luther King in your speeches, and you say it's not where we've come from, it's where we're going. So if you had to project the next just decade, after 30 years of immense and immeasurable service, how would you paint that next 10 years for you and for Homeboy?
Well, Martin Luther King was talking about church, and he says, church is not the place you come to, it's the place you go from. So he's trying to get folks to not stay complacent, and he's trying to disrupt a kind of a status quo and what we've settled for as a society. But I believe that people are good, thoroughly good. It's just that they don't know it, or they've forgotten, or they have to be reintroduced to their own tenderness and kindness and brilliance. And so, I'm happy that Homeboy has become this model, and that there are 141 programs in the United States and 16 outside the country who have all come to our place and have started similar programs to kind of stand at the margins, because that's the only place where the margins get erased. And so the more that happens in an incremental, slow way, the better. And, I know folks who work at Homeboy, they know the experience of not becoming depleted. They're exhausted, but they're not depleted. And that's because they go there every day, including folks who are here tonight, to be reached by folks who are trustworthy guides, who know what it's like to have been cut off. And because they've suffered that particular pain, they're the ones who will lead the rest of us to the kinship of God. And so that doesn't deplete you. That fulfills you.
That's enough.
Okay.
That's pretty perfect.
It's past my bedtime. Does anybody care about
Radical
that?
Disruptors. Thank you.